Someone needs to stop me, okay? Anyway, we mentioned yesterday about the tree of Genesis. They will also begin a whole theology about the idea of the wood. And to us, that's not a huge thing. But if you lived in the Mideast, you'd discover that wood is in fact a huge thing in the Mideast. They don't have trees. That's why we see all this talk about the cedars of Lebanon. Do you know, around the Mediterranean in general, anyone who wanted to have a ship, if you wanted a mast on the ship, it had to come from the cedars of Lebanon. They didn't come from anywhere else. And so the cedars of Lebanon got a mystical thing because trees were so totally rare. I think you know when they built the temple in Jerusalem, they had to go to Lebanon to get the wood because they were using large beams, you know. But the type of wood they have in the Holy Land is very low trees, and they tend, oftentimes during wars and stuff, they would always take down trees. So wood became a very mystical thing. So they began a whole theology around Noah and the idea of Noah's saving the people and everything because he built the ship out of wood. And in the same way that God, through the inspiration, actually created out of wood what would guarantee you and I would live forever, which ultimately was seen as the cross. Another one has to do with Isaac. Do you remember the story of Abraham and Isaac? I always like to put these in historical context so people understand them. I'm going to tell you a couple things about that is not generally known if you don't study Scripture. But when you begin to study about different cultures, you will learn that the most basic form of worshiping God is human sacrifice. And it's universal over the world. Oftentimes you and I forget the one thing that makes the Judeo-Christian and Muslim traditions unique. And what is true to our tradition, but actually is found in no other tradition anywhere in the world, is we believe God spoke to us. We believe God found us. When you hold this, you get a very different attitude to things than if you happen to hold the fact that we have to find God. But if you go into any other religious tradition, when they talk about sacred literature, they're talking about holy things written by great Buddhists or great Hindus or something like that. But what they call their sacred literature is a collection of great things written by their people. In the Jewish, the Christian, and the Muslim tradition, we maintain that our sacred literature, in fact, was written by God. So it isn't, you know, a holy person trying to find God. It's God speaking to us. Well, one of the interesting things, if you imagine who God is, and you and I are trying to figure out what he wants, what people tended to do was to give God the most valuable thing they have. And without going through a long process of it, the most valuable thing you have on the face of the earth is human life. The most precious human life you have on the face of the earth is your child. And the most important of those is your first child. So if you were to go into the world, you find out that most religions, you could take Aztecs, Mayas, American Indians in North America, you can take native religions in Hawaii. You can take them in the Polynesia. You can take them anywhere in the world. They end up with human worship, and usually the sacrifice of children. If you were to go into the world of Abraham, you'd discover that when you got married, you would move in with your in-laws, and you would move in with the man's parents or the woman's parents, according to who's wealthier. I don't know if you're familiar with this in Japan, for instance. When a man and a woman marry, they take the last name of the most prominent family. So like if I were to marry a young lady whose name was Miyako Toyota, my last name would become Toyota, trust me, okay? So they would go into, you know, the more prominent or better known name. So when you go into their culture, they would move into the family. that was more prominent. And you would stay there until the birth of your firstborn child. When your firstborn child was there, then you would care for this child until you had a second child. As soon as you had the second child, you would sacrifice your firstborn child to God. Once that child was sacrificed, you would take the body of that child and you would bury that child. And when you buried that child, you built the door to your home over that child's grave. And that way evil spirits could never attack you, because anytime evil spirits came to your house, the evil spirits were reminded you had already given God the most important thing in the world. So nothing evil could ever cross that threshold. And that's why, like, if you've ever been in any, this is something that's very rare, but sometimes you'll encounter it in primitive cultures. Have you ever been anywhere where you were told not to step on the stoop when you go in the house? That's where that comes from. In the ancient days, the stoop was in fact a gravestone. And so you stepped over it. No one ever stepped on it. Okay? Now, and some people even talk about it today, but they have no idea where it comes from. But anyway, everyone would do that, and then you could live in your own home. You couldn't have your home until you could do that, you know. So now we go to Abraham. Abraham is a holy, committed man, and I think you know he didn't have a child. He was very old. So they have this child, and then when this child begins to grow, this child reaches the age of 12, and there is no second child. Well, another interesting law in the Holy Land is that if you're under 12, you're a child, and a child has virtually no rights. You can sacrifice a child to God. Over the age of 12, you're an adult, then it becomes murder. You can't do it. So Abraham is caught in a bind. He doesn't have the second child with which to console the family. And he won't be able to sacrifice this child next year. So he does what he believes God commands him to do, which is to sacrifice the child. I want you to understand, God never told Abraham to sacrifice the child. He understood that was what God wanted, because that's what everyone did. And so Abraham goes up on the mountain, he raises the knife, and the angel grabs his hand. And he discovers the first and most important thing about our God. Our God is a God of life, not death. He is honored by life, not by death. He's honored by the fullness of life, not by a diminishing of life. Our God is life in every possible aspect of it. Now, Abraham is faced with the test. The test wasn't whether or not he'd kill a kid. That wasn't the test. The test was whether Abraham had the courage to come down that mountain with his firstborn child into a community of people, every one of whom had killed their firstborn child because they believed it was what God wanted. And I don't know how much traveling you have done internationally. It is very difficult to live in a community of people who have made some huge sacrifice to God because they believe he wanted it, and you aren't making that sacrifice. You are not welcome there. So, Abraham became a wanderer the rest of his life. Never settled down, okay? Didn't dare build a house. Wouldn't do it. Became a nomadic man, okay? So you understand all of that, okay? So I want you to understand the importance of that. Well, now we begin to look at that. I'll tell you a very interesting thing about the Abraham story, if you remember it. Do you remember that when Abraham was going up to the mountain and taking Isaac with him, he had Isaac carry the wood? Well, Jesus carried the wood of his own sacrifice when he went to be sacrificed as well. And so they see this as a relationship to the thing of this business of life being connected with this wood and sacrifice. So they see him tied to the Isaac story as well. Okay? Do you realize how complicated this is becoming? It's becoming very, very complex. Now, having said all of that, what I'm going to do is go first of all to the texts that you decided to use as the retreat, and go a little bit with it. Remember, Now, when Jesus is preaching, Jesus' reference to the cross are never to the crucifix. Jesus' reference to the cross are to the pre-Roman understanding that you must carry the difficulties of your life. You must carry whatever it is in your life. When Jesus dies on the cross and rises, then it's probably 30 to 40 years before the first gospel account is written. So when the author records Jesus speaking of the cross, the author knows about the crucifixion of Jesus. So you have two layers of meaning in this automatically. You have the layer of Jesus talking about the difficulties of daily life, and you have the layer of the author knowing that the major difficulty in the life of Jesus is the cross. Okay? So he sort of puts that together. And so this is the thing, and this appears almost verbatim in Mark, Matthew, and Luke. Okay? Almost verbatim. But I will take it out of Matthew. It says, no, why don't I take it Mark? This is his day. We'll give him hit. Okay, we'll take it out of Mark. Okay? It says, Jesus summoned the crowd with his disciples and said to them, if you ever want to do serious Bible study, one of the most important things about Bible study that people practically never notice is who Jesus is talking to. Okay? He will say different things to different people. Like, one time he's talking about a group of pagans, and he's talking to the apostles. And the apostles are concerned because one of the pagans has tossed out a demon and using Jesus' name. They say, we need to stop him. And Jesus says, no one who is not against us is an enemy. He says, if they are not against us, they're for us. And one time, the apostles are doing something, I forget what it was, and Jesus will turn to them and say, if you're not for me, you're against me. Well, the fact of the matter is, if I'm a believer and I'm not committed to Jesus, I'm an enemy. If I'm a non-believer and not against Jesus, I'm a friend. But as a believer, I must be really committed. And that's something always to remember when we are dealing with non-Christians. Any non-Christian who is not a stated enemy of Jesus, Jesus considers on his side. Always remember that. He says, if they are not against us, they are actually for us. So if we were talking to a non-believer, so Jesus would tolerate a lot more from a non-believer than he would from me. Okay, a non-believer simply has to not be an enemy, and then they are open to conversion. Okay, but a person who is within the community, when I was at Berkeley, one of the great speakers who used to come there was Angela Davis. Angela Davis was probably the most academically attuned communist since Dorothy Day. Dorothy Day, I think was a very astute communist. And if you ever study communism in college, you'll study her writings. She is the most educated, and then she went through the conversion, and became a Catholic and all this sort of thing. God has a knack for picking up people who think they're his enemies. But anyway, so he picked up Dorothy Day. But after Dorothy Day, the next most educated person was Angela Davis. And I was listening to her lecture one time at Berkeley, and she said, if you want to destroy an institution, she says, you should never attack it. She says, the stupidest way to try and destroy an institution is to attack it. Because if you attack an institution, you just make it stronger in resisting you. And she said, I'll cite Ford Motor Company. She says, if you wanted to destroy Ford Motor Company, she says, you wouldn't try and disrupt things because they'd just take 2 guards, put you outside the fence, and leave you there. There'd be no problem at all. Says, if you want to destroy Ford Motor, what you do is get a job on the assembly line and do nothing. Every time the bolt passes you, don't tighten it. Okay? People will stop buying Fords pretty quickly. Has it ever occurred to you how many people in the Catholic Church do absolutely nothing? They show up for Mass on Sunday as spectators, They would like to be served popcorn. We don't do that, okay? But they come up as spectators and sit through the service. You wonder, how have we survived 2,000 years when most of the people Do absolutely nothing. And it's the surest way to destroy an institution. The surest way. Anyway. So, notice that this is spoken both to the crowd and to the disciples. Like when you hear the Beatitudes, Jesus does not speak the Beatitudes to the crowd. Beatitudes are only to the apostles. Okay? Listen, though, when he's teaching. If you're serious about understanding a text, always look at who he's talking to. Okay? Sometimes you have to go back several chapters. If he's going through a long talk, you have to go back and figure out. But what he says is most important in the light of the people to whom he's speaking. Jesus says, "Whoever wishes to come after me must deny the self, take up the cross, and follow me." So the first thing he's saying is, if you want to follow me, okay, so this is the thing. That's why he's speaking to the crowd. You know, if he's speaking to the apostles, he'd never say that because they ostensibly want to follow him. You know, they've made that commitment. But he's speaking to the crowd. He says, if you want to follow me, he says, you must take up your cross and follow me. And this idea then of taking up the cross, to understand this in the Greek sense, it has to do with the difficulties and problems in everyday life. Okay? So if you want to follow Jesus Christ, you really need to take up the difficulties of human life. Now, my experience of human life, as I've watched in myself, I have finally come to the conclusion that problems and blessings are so totally interwoven that it is not possible to separate them. And the more blessings you have, the more problems you will have. They are intimately connected. The way to get rid of problems is to get rid of blessings. Okay? And you simply cannot disconnect them. I'll give you some very simple ones. If you want to be a doctor, let's say an MD, what you do normally, I presume a doctor imagines himself in a beautifully paneled office with all this gleaming equipment, a very sexy nurse, and, you know, this sort of setup, and people come in, you say a few choice words, their lives are changed, they're healed, and they go home. Okay? No one who decides to become a doctor ever thinks of 8 years of medical school dealing with dead bodies. That never occurs to a doctor. But you know, unless you're willing to put 8 years into autopsies, you'll never see that office. Goes through the same thing with law and everything. And those are very, very simple things. In human life, every blessing has a price. Okay? And just to kind of know that. I'll give you an example in my own life. I have a crippling dyslexia. Just if I were any more dyslexic, I wouldn't be in school at all. And when I was, as a youngster, my parents understood. I had two brilliant parents. My mother was an RN, my dad an engineer. And they understood very quickly that I had a learning disability. At that time, they didn't know anything about learning disabilities. When I was a child, I was just stupid. So my parents understood very quickly. Do you know at noon, my parents got me out of school every day at noon. I went to school classes in the morning. At noon, my parents, I was born and raised in San Diego, registered me in classes at the museums. So that huge museum complex downtown San Diego, I participated in surgeries on tigers. I helped to classify the stones in the geology section. I helped to assemble dinosaur skeletons. I helped to stuff bird, specimens. I go through 1,000 things, and no one learns by doing like I do. I just have, you cannot believe, I have an avalanche of information. I am as much of an encyclopedia as you can get without binding, you know? I have just an encyclopedic amount of information, and it comes from that. It comes from doing. My parents recognized very early. Then when we entered the seminary, one of the things they did in the seminary was that each class of students would get together and we would, the seminary classes are very, very extensive, probably twice as many classes as you would take if you were a regular college student. And the reason is, we aren't dating and we live right there at the seminary. So there's this whole thing of, the idea was you were there for the thing. So we had these huge amounts of studies. Well, one of the things we used to do is we got together as a group of a class, and you'd assign a different person to take the notes in each class. So you just had to take notes in one class. And then they would publish the notes, you'd type them out and pass them to everyone. So we did this probably about the first week, and then they had a class meeting, and I was dreading the class meeting because my spelling, that's another thing of dyslexia. The spelling is just horrendous. So I dreaded that meeting. And as soon as we sat down the meeting, they said, Jim, we wanted to talk to you particularly. And I said, yes. They said, we would like you to take notes in all the classes. I said, what do you mean? And they said, well, everyone comes out with this ream of notes, and usually you will come out with 5 or 6 sentences that actually are everything the professor said. Because I think if you go to a lecture, they repeat themselves. Well, I skip all of that. So one of the things about dyslexia is you can't deal with anything complicated. So in dyslexia, you reduce everything. So they says, you take all the notes, we will get someone else to correct your spelling, and we will have someone else type them and distribute them. But the further I went on in school, the more I realized what an unbelievable blessing dyslexia was for me. And the place it has most affected me is preaching. I am very clear. Whether you agree with me or not, at least you know what I've said, And that's one of the things of dyslexia. But that's just one example. If you want to follow Jesus Christ, pick up your cross. If your cross is dyslexia, learn to carry it. There'll be blessings from it one day. Just learn to carry it. If your cross is some kind of a disability, pick it up. Whatever it is, you want to follow Jesus Christ, just pick up your cross. And I'll tell you a secret. You're picking up a blessing. You may not know it yet. Some things, the blessing precedes the cross. I think an example of that is marriage and raising children. I think the blessing comes first, the cross comes later, but they're joined. They're joined, When I'm doing a marriage, I think the last line of a marriage is what God has joined together, let no man put asunder. Deep in my heart, I'm saying goodbye and good luck, And the same thing with the birth of a child. They bring a child in for baptism, they're all dewy-eyed and smiles and everything. Goodbye and good luck. But you need to understand that's true of everything in life. Everything in life. Sometimes the blessing precedes the price. Sometimes the price precedes the blessing. But every blessing has a price, and every price has a blessing. The one who chooses to follow Jesus picks it up and accepts that. There are a remarkable number of people who try and go through life and get all the blessings without the price, and they will fail. The problem is you end up without the blessings and with the price. It's just one of the strange things about human life. It's really a strange thing. Okay? Now, he says, whoever wishes to save his life is going to lose it. Whoever loses his life for my sake will find it. Same type of thing. One of the things that has most amazed me in my life in the study of sacred scripture is how remarkably true scripture is of life. Like people hear these things and they sound mystical and holy and all. They aren't. They're actually what's a part of life. There are 2 ways to go through life. One way to go through life is to preserve your life, and the other way to go through life is to live your life. You can't do both. You can't do both. I'll give you an example. Most people, in order to sanely walk the streets of our world, most people have phobias. You think phobias are crazy. A lot of women have a snake or spider phobias, okay? And people think, phobias are crazy. Phobias are the healthiest way you can deal with human life. If you have a phobia about spiders, if you're deathly afraid of spiders, do you know what you have done? You have psychologically taken your fear of death and put it in spiders. And why do you do that? You do that because it takes your fear of life out of the rest of your life. When you go out the front door of your house, it never occurs to you you might be hit by lightning. But you know, more people are hit by lightning than killed by spiders in the United States each day. Okay? But you've put your terror into the spider. And then you walk out the front of your house, and you get in your car, and you turn the key, on the assumption it will start and not blow up. And very seldom do cars blow up. But every year, more people die in car fires than are killed by spiders. Then you get in that car and go on the freeway. I could go through this all day. But do you know you live under a threat of death 24 hours a day, but because you had the good sense to be scared of spiders, you'll never notice it. You'll never notice it. It'll all come on you when you see the spider, okay? Now I want you to understand, a lot of times people ridicule people for this. This is one of the healthiest ways of living. If you were actually afraid of real things, you'd lock yourself in a closet and starve to death. You know, you would. You could be poisoned by food, this sort of thing. I'll give you an example in my own life. I am absolutely terrified of roller coasters. You know, I regard whoever invented the roller coaster flat out possessed. I have no problems. Flat out possessed, you know. And I have a good friend who's absolutely addicted. And we used to travel a lot together. We still travel a lot together. It's just that he's married now, so it's his wife's problem. But anyway, when we would go traveling, he and I would oftentimes end up on roller coasters because that's, you know, what he likes to do. So we go on roller coasters. And we get on the roller coaster. The thing in his mind is, we're going to have a great trip on the roller coaster. We're going to get off. We're going to have a beer and laugh about it. When I got on the roller coaster, the thing in my mind is, we're about to be killed, okay? And the whole thing, I'm always thinking we're going to die. And the whole thing, he thinks it's going to be wonderful, okay? Both of us are screaming, but for different reasons. And so we go through this entire procedure. And when one day we're killed on a roller coaster, we will be, I mean, I have no doubt. But one day when we are finally killed on the roller coaster, do you know the only difference between the two of us? He will have enjoyed the ride. Okay? We'll both be dead. I won't live 1 second longer because I was terrified. And he won't die 1 second earlier because he was smiling. The only difference is he enjoyed the ride. I want you to know life is exactly like that. If you decide to preserve your life and save your life, you're going to die just like the rest of us, but you will have skipped living. Okay? The classic example of this, which you know very well, is Howard Hughes, richest man in the entire world. How did he die? Hotel Caracas. He had the top floor, and the top floor of the hotel was a pyramidal hotel. Top floor was probably half again as big as this room. And Howard Hughes sat in the center of the room, stark naked, on a wooden chair. Around the edge of the room were several doctors and nurses. Howard Hughes would not let them close to him, except they had to because he was afraid of being infected, afraid of everything. Now imagine this is the richest man in the entire world. There was a young man, God knows who he was, we'll call him Juan, okay? Some young guy who worked in the kitchen, whose job it was to bring the meal up. And you know, Juan would get up, God knows the hours Juan worked, and he'd get up and he'd bring this meal up, and the doctors and nurses would treat it medically, would irradiate it and everything. You know, God knows what they did to this meal. And then they would hand it to Howard Hughes, and he would eat it. And then Juan would take these dishes back to the kitchen. You know the difference between Juan and Howard Hughes? Juan had a life. He actually went home. He actually had a family. He walked the streets, you know, probably danced, had a beer. One had a life. Howard Hughes had money. Howard Hughes had everything but his fear of death. And you know, Howard Hughes is dead. Okay? It didn't work. Okay? So the idea here is he says, don't try and save your life. Try and live your life. Okay? And Jesus adds something to this too. He says, when you're finished with this one, I'm going to give you another one anyway. Okay? So enjoy this life. Live it. Actually live it. Okay? So now understand, this is a basic teaching of the cross. Remember I told you that when God, the very first thing of Abraham, it's God wants life. God wants fullness of life, completeness of life, richness of life, all this sort of thing. Well, you also notice that's the teaching of the cross. Jesus could have avoided the cross by not preaching. Jesus could have avoided the cross by not going to Jerusalem. I give you a dozen ways Jesus could have avoided the cross, and it's debated by theologians today why he didn't take that path. But the reason he didn't take that path is Jesus decided to live his life to the fullest. And his life to the fullest was to enjoy and experience every single gift God gave him. And if the price of that was the cross, so much the better. You're going to die anyway. So he lived his life, lived it completely, richly, and fully. You know, this is something that has really permeated Catholic teaching a lot since the Second Vatican Council. Historically, they have often understood the cross as a symbol of suffering, but as a symbol of suffering independently of the benefits. So they saw Jesus as suffering on the cross, but they saw that as independent from Jesus' rich life of teaching and curing. But the cross is there because he spent a life teaching and curing. You know, if he'd spent his life as a carpenter in Nazareth, you and I wouldn't even know his name. Okay? But he went through this really rich life, and the price of it was this. When you disconnect the cross, what you end up is seeing an inordinate value in suffering as suffering. The church has never really seen suffering as valuable in itself. What happened in the early church was we had this great wave of martyrdoms that took place, a huge amount of people dying for the faith. When the martyrdom period was over and people were no longer dying for their faith, people began to think, well, we really need to kind of suffer. And you do, but you have to understand there is suffering intimately connected with life. Like, for instance, if you really want to suffer, you don't wear a hair shirt, and you don't wear a barbed wire cincture, and you don't beat yourself. Because I'll tell you a suffering that is much worse than that. It's raising a teenager. Okay? You want to suffer, live your life. Okay? But suffering, to work for suffering itself, first of all, it does nothing for you, and you haven't lived life. But if you live life, there's suffering, and you need to learn to accept the suffering that's connected to your life, whatever it is. And they're very peculiar to people's lives. But I think one of the interesting things, you begin to look at the peculiarity of your sufferings. Like I had polio as a youngster and stuff, and I began to look at the peculiarities of the particular sufferings. In many ways, I had some very terrible sufferings very early. But the fact of the matter is, when I look at what's actually come from it, I thank God every day for the things that happened in my life, because they've made me who I am. And I really wouldn't choose to be anybody else. You know, to come to this understanding that the great blessing of Jesus is, Jesus tells me to take up my cross. And when I take up my cross, I understand I have actually put on the crown of glory. They're intimately connected. You know, I had a dream one time when we had the Good Friday celebrations in the seminary. And I have a background, I mentioned a lot of you in art. And so I have very, very strong, vivid dreams. But we had the Good Friday service. And when I was asleep, I saw like this large room, I guess something like this. In the center of the room was a white, I guess a square pillar, flat on it, and on it there was something. And as I went closer and closer to it, it was a crown of thorns. But it was a crown of thorns made out of glass. It looked like it had been made by Steuben or, Galway glass or one of these, just the most beautiful thin things. And from each of the points was hanging a cut and polished ruby. It's the whole idea of what the suffering of Jesus really is. You cannot separate the crown of glory from the crown of thorns. Okay? And everyone wants the crown of glory, and no one will pick up the crown of thorns. Okay? So to understand, Jesus commands us to do that. Then he says, what profit would it be for one to gain the whole world and forfeit his life? This is very interesting. Who gained the whole world and forfeited his life? Howard Hughes. He gained the whole world, richest man in the entire world. And he gave up his life. There isn't a single one of us here who couldn't better spend that money than he did. Not a single one of us, And the fact of the matter is, he had the whole world, but he'd given up his life. And he says, what would anyone give in exchange for his life? The fact of the matter is, you cannot answer that if you've given up your life. That's how Satan gets people to give up their lives. They really do not know anymore. And the key is to be willing to bear all of this and accept the life that comes with it, the great power of the life. He says, the Son of Man will come with his angels in his Father's glory, and whoever is ashamed of me and of my words in this faithless and sinful generation, the Son of Man will be ashamed of when he comes in his Father's glory with the angels. He says ultimately that you and I stand before God, and ultimately in the presence of God we have this having accepted, our cross, and accepting our cross, the glory that comes with it is what's acknowledged in the presence of God. Every person has a glory connected with the cross. Okay? And I think sometimes in our lives, in fact often, I think we have the choice of rejecting certain sufferings. And you have to understand that when you reject a certain suffering, you're also rejecting a blessing that comes with it. But there's no crime to that. There's no crime to that. Paul is very clear, like becoming a priest, about the idea of giving up the onus of raising a family. And Paul says, I'd really prefer you do that. But Paul understands he's asking us to give up certainly a lot of problems, but a lot of blessings. There are a lot of blessings that come with children as well, But he's asking us to give that. But understand, those are always married. There's always married. And be very cautious in your life when you have the opportunity to avoid a suffering. I'll ask you, very carefully examine it before you avoid it. If you still want to avoid it, by all means, again, I think that you're free to do that, But just know, each time I avoid a suffering, I've avoided a little bit of life, okay? If you have the opportunity to take things of life on you, understand there's going to be a suffering that comes with it too, okay? All I'm asking you to do is be sane. Just be sane, okay? Life is always those things. I'd like now to take you to a parallel text. Remember I told you that it appears in Mark, Matthew, and Luke? It is duplicated at a much later chapter in Luke. It appears at the same point, as I mentioned earlier, with Mark. But now Luke brings it up a second time, and it's slightly different. And when he brings it up again in chapter 14, verse 27. He says, whoever does not carry his cross after me cannot be my disciple. Okay? Now, again, if you don't study Scripture professionally, you might not notice the difference. The first time he said, take up the cross. And this time he says, carry the cross. And that's the difference between an event and a process. And you see, when Jesus was originally preaching, and they were writing under the impact of Jesus' death, they thought of the carrying of the cross in the light of Jesus' crucifixion, which is an event. But after analyzing the teaching and coming to a better understanding, they realized the cross is a process. It's a process. And it's not a matter of, you pick up the cross, you nail to it, and it's over. No. You pick up the cross and you carry the cross every day of your life. It isn't just picking it up. It's carrying the cross. And one of the things that is most amazing when you study the history of saints is how many saints have come to realize the great power of their cross and come to have a passion for their cross because of the glory that was connected with it. But you see them as this passion to the cross. Okay? And he says, which of you, wishing to construct a tower, does not first sit down and calculate the cost to see if there's enough for its completion? Otherwise, after laying the foundation and finding yourself unable to finish the work, the onlookers would laugh at you, saying, this is the one who began to build but did not have the resources to finish. Okay? I don't know how many of you have ever visited Toronto, but if you ever get a chance to visit Toronto, Canada, there's an amazing building outside Toronto called Casa Loma. And Casa Loma is very much like the Hearst Castle, except that the man who built it ran out of money. And what he did was he went all over Europe and he picked out rooms he liked in buildings. And when he found a room he liked in the building, he sent an architect over and they duplicated it in building Casa Loma. And it was to be his home. Casa Loma, one of the most interesting things about it is that there's a great distance between the first floor and the second floor, and it seems kind of unreasonable until you actually go through the rooms. And because he's duplicating European rooms, no two of them are the same height. So the next floor had to be as far as the top floor, okay? And so actually, between the first floor and the second floor, there's a whole floor of storage. Think of it as a closet, an entire floor that's a closet, okay? And you can enter it at different places, and the closet is different heights as you go through it. And so, but anyway, the building, it was very interesting, but he ran out of money. And suddenly couldn't, let me tell you the thing that most impressed me. I guess, anyway, what most impressed me was the shower. You go into the shower and you close the shower, very large shower, and you're surrounded by pipes. And the water comes at you from above and all the sides. And there are 6 faucets. 2 of them are water. 1 of them is soap. And the other 2 are perfumes. What a life. Anyway. But as it was, he never finished it. And because he didn't finish it, people in Toronto would point at it and ridicule him. The idea, look at this sort of thing. And what Jesus is talking about here is you and I need to understand that we enter into this relationship with Jesus. When we enter into this relationship with Jesus, you really need to have a commitment to it. I personally believe that Jesus is amazingly gentle with regards to this. But trust me, when you enter the relationship with Jesus, you are going to end up with nothing. That's the nature of the relationship. That Jesus ultimately will demand everything from you. And you'll end up with Jesus ultimately. But it is a process. And I think he's kind and nice about it. But when you go in, you need to realize, it reminds you of St. Augustine, the famous quote from St. Augustine. He says, I was afraid to choose you for fear I would have nothing else. But having chose you, I discovered there is nothing else. And so that ultimately this is what everything's about. But as we turn to Jesus, There's a very famous story in the Charismatic Renewal. I have a lot of interesting stories, but this story in the Charismatic Renewal is about a man who decides that he really wants to enter into the relationship with Jesus. And Jesus says, to be in a relationship with me, all you have to do is give up everything you have. He says, simple enough. So he empties his pockets. He says, here, everything I have. Jesus says, okay. And he says, just one thing, Jesus. He says, can I take back my car key? Jesus says, why? And he says, well, I need to drive my car. Jesus says, you have a car? And he says, oh, yes. Well, you really need to give up your car. Well, how will I get home? Home? You have a home? Yeah. But, you know, and I mean, it's wife, children, everything by the time. It's a shaggy dog. How long? Anyway, but you can just go on it forever. And, you know, I think that's what Jesus does in our lives. And you'll go through a period of time in your life where that'll go on. And I'll tell you, you reach a point in your life where he then begins to take apart your body. We call that the aging process. But you'll go through a process of your life. He'll take everything you have, and then he'll take everything you are. But he does it very, very gently. It's a very gentle thing. But no, when you enter the relationship with Jesus, this is it. When everything's finished, you will have absolutely nothing but God. Absolutely nothing but Jesus. Remember, that's the prayer of the psalmist. One thing I ask of God, this alone I seek, to dwell in the house of the Lord, and all my days to gaze on the loveliness of your home. That's exactly what we're offered. But it is this process. And when you enter the process, be at peace. That's what's going to happen. Okay? Then he mentions the other side of the process. He says, what king marching into battle would not first sit down and decide whether with 10,000 troops he could successfully oppose another king advancing upon him with 20,000 troops? If not, you ask for peace before you get to the other king. Okay? And so you and I need to know, number one, what's going to be asked of us, and number two, whether we have made the actual commitment to be involved in that. If we understand what's asked of us, and again, I think God does it very gently, very, very easily. And I look at, you know, someone who did it very dramatically, like Francis of Assisi. You know, God came to Francis of Assisi, he says, sell what you have, give to the poor, come follow me. I think, you know, Francis took off his clothes and walked out of the building naked. And what Francis discovered was God was not asking anything of Francis, but was offering to make him the happiest man who had ever walked the face of the earth. That's exactly what happened. Most of us don't have the insight to realize that's what's going on. So I think Jesus stands there, like the guy with the car keys. He stands there, and he just slowly lets the process go on. I think for some of us, we need to get a little way into the process to realize it's actually good. Some people are better at it and go through it. But ultimately, everyone goes through that process. That we will go through the process, and God asks things of us. And just like Abraham, you know, he asked his son of Abraham. But he didn't ask his son because he was going to kill him. He asked his son because he was going to let Abraham's son live. So to remember, in everything God's asking of us, everything God's doing, ours is a Lord of life. And the thing that God is most interested in when he looks at me is that I should have a life that is insanely happy. That is what he's about. But the funny thing is, the process to that is to pick up the cross, just as he did, and to march forward to the death, to the resurrection, to the ascension, to sitting one day at the right hand of my Father. Thank you very much.